observant. They don't have a prayer life. They don't have a devotion life. They have no thought of God. They don't consider how God would view things. They're just non-observant, but put to the task or pressured, they would say to you, I'm a Christian. And so we see some similarities in the people in the time of Esther and the people today that we worship with, maybe. So we spoke last week that God hasn't forgotten them, and that this book shows that even when someone or a bunch of someones are out of God's will, God, can still direct them through his providential hand in their lives. So we defined last week, and I want to do that one more time. What is providence? Providence is the means by which God directs all things, both animate and inanimate, seen and unseen, good and evil, toward a worthy purpose, which means his will must finally prevail. That is what we think of when we think about the providence of God. It's this very simple statement. You hear us say it all the time. Sometimes people probably think this is a cop-out. It's not a cop-out. It is a deeply held belief. God is sovereign. God is absolutely in control. Colossians 1:17, we just covered this a week or two back. All things consist in him. And so he is completely and absolutely in control. He may not be known, he may not be seen, he may not be remembered, but he is always sovereign. Nothing is happening outside of the knowledge of God. Remember, Christ would say to the disciples, describing the sparrows and how that 2 of them were purchased for a farthing, but not one would ever fall that God was unaware of. And he would go on to say, likewise, he knows the hairs on your head. And so God is completely sovereign. And that is what this book is teaching us. Last week, we noted 2 decisions in chapter 1 that were worthy of consideration. One by Queen Vashti and one by King Xerxes, or as he's referred to here, Ahasuerus. And the one by Queen Vashti was the decision to refuse to show herself. Remember, the king wanted her to come in and parade in front of all of these other princes and leaders. And there is possibly that he wanted her to unveil herself, or some say maybe that he wanted her naked, nude, except for the crown. And she refused to do that. It was not becoming of a Persian queen to do so. And we talked about that, setting the example that right is right no matter the consequence or the cost. Now remember, I'm not suggesting that you emulate Queen Vashti. She was a Persian queen, likely wicked to the bone. But in that moment, she made the right decision, and we can see that. The second decision was made by the king. His failure comes when he chooses to make a decision while he is drunk, while he is embarrassed, and while he is angry. And so, like a petulant child, he makes a rash, temper-driven decision that he would later regret. And we came up with this truth: never make a permanent decision about a temporary problem, and never make a decision in anger. I would say to you, from a leadership perspective, and many of you are leaders, you should never make a decision based on emotions. That's very hard. That's easy to say, but it's hard to do. I would tell you that even now, with the current situation where we are no live audience on Wednesday night, no live audience on Sunday night, no Tuesday night visitation, no Wednesday night small groups, no prayer meeting, no Sunday school, only the 2 worship services on Sunday morning and everything else being virtual, it's very hard not to make an emotional decision in that place. It would be easy for me to emotionally say, look, I'm not going to do that anymore. We're going to open the church and we're going to move forward. But I have to be careful not to make an emotional decision. That's exactly what the king did, and he was wrong for it. He made an emotional decision. This week, we want to look at chapter 2. And in this chapter, we're going to have the entrance of 2 more of our main characters. The first one is Mordecai, the Jew. The second, of course, is Esther, who is his cousin, basically, but he has raised her like a daughter. And we also are going to meet a lonely and a remorseful King Xerxes. And then we will be introduced to this contest. And you can call it a beauty pageant, if you will. And it is to determine who will be the replacement for Queen Vashti. Before we look at it, I don't want us to lose sight of the underlying theme of this historical account. It is all about the providential hand of God. If we come to the book of Esther looking to glean only leadership ideas, we're missing the point. If we come looking to glean only character traits or things that we should or should not do, we're missing the point. If we come only to study what I would call a Cinderella story of this refugee, immigrant young lady who becomes the queen, the most powerful lady in the land, we are missing the point. The point is the unseen hand of God directing the path of all man's activities. It's providential, and it is at work to bring about his plan and his purpose. In this case, we have God working through a pagan queen, Vashti, a pagan king, Xerxes, a lost battle, which I'm going to tell you about in a moment, a beauty pageant, an unknown old man, and an obscure young woman, and a hateful bigot. That's really what you have happening here. And with those odd characters, God is going to bring about salvation to the Jews of that time. It's an overwhelming example of God's sovereignty. God is absolutely directing the events in this book. But I have more to tell you. God is absolutely directing the events of today as well. I don't want to be a broken record, but I want you to understand that God is not caught off guard by anything that is occurring. Listen, he knew this was going to take place. In fact, if we follow the providence of God, we believe that God is orchestrating this to his glory and to the victory of his people. That's very difficult for us. But God is directing everything that we see. This is my fear. It's not my only fear, but it is a fear. My fear is that we spend too much time attempting to understand every element of God's plan and too little time obeying God's commands. That is one fear that I have. While we are trying to understand every little facet of God's plan, we miss the opportunity to be obedient. It would not be an overreach to say that God was aware. Now, I'm talking about the book of Esther here. If you've read the book before, you know that, and I'm not trying to be a spoiler, but you know that soon enough, Haman is going to reveal himself, and he is a lifelong hater of the Jews. It's bred in him to hate them, and he's going to be aroused. His hatred is going to be aroused by disrespect from Mordecai, and he is going to seek to wipe out all of the Jews in the land. in all 127 provinces. You're talking about something along the lines of what Adolf Hitler attempted to do. It is not outside of understanding, or it's not an overreach to say that God was aware of wicked Haman long before anyone else was. That he knew about his lifelong hatred of the Jews, that he knew that he would be promoted in a period of time, it turns out about 5 years, after an unsuccessful coup against the king, and that he would seek to exterminate the Jews, and that the king would allow it, and that only Esther, a young Jewess, would be able to stop this annihilation. But in order to do that, she must be close to the king. And in order to be close, she must be the queen. And if she would be the queen, Vashti must be disposed or deposed. That's not outside of understanding. That's not an overreach. When we think about why, or we're still trying to understand a 180-day party. And God has moved 5 years down the road to inserting Esther in the king's palace to deal with wicked Haman. And we're still trying to understand, why did he have a 180-day party? That's what I'm talking about. We get so caught up in the minutia of the plan that we fail to be obedient to the overreaching commands of God. Here, God is 5 years ahead. In fact, God's not even concerned about time. He's outside of time. He's timeless. The beauty of the book of Esther is not found in a Cinderella story. It isn't found in a beauty pageant. It isn't found in the overthrow of Haman or the protection of the Jews. The beauty is that God was always aware and in control for the outcome of his choosing. That's the beauty. Do I desire a powerful God in my life? I do. But more than that, I desire an all-knowing God. I desire a God who's always present. This is what this book paints the picture for us of a God that is outside of time and can see everything and protect us. I have news for you. The same God that was working in the days of Esther is working today. He hasn't changed. The theological word for that is immutable. It's changeless. He's incapable of changing. By the way, Hebrews 13:8 says that of the Lord Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. They are immutable, changeless. The God I read about in the Bible, the God that brought down Egypt with plagues, the God that brought Israel across the Red Sea on dry ground and drowned all of Pharaoh's army in that sea, the God that brought water from a rock, the God that did all of those things is the same God that is sovereign in the life of me today and you today. He's lost nothing. He is the God of now. He said, I am. So we think about this. Let's look at verse 1. And we're only going to be a few moments, I promise. Look at verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. There's a hidden pain in that verse. I want you to know first and foremost, there is approximately 4 years that pass between verse 22 of chapter 1 and verse 1 of chapter 2. 4 years. You know this because in a moment you'll read verse 16 of chapter 2 that by the time Esther becomes the queen, it's the 7th year of his reign. And during the party, it was the 3rd year. Historically, we can go back and discover that during that period of time, this king, Ahasuerus, Xerxes, who was a warrior king, remember the 180-day celebration was celebrating victory. After that was over, after he deposed Vashti, he went out to conquer again. He went to conquer Greece. He was unsuccessful. And he comes back. That's the things that this occurs after. He has gone out to conquer. He has been unsuccessful in conquering. He has come back to his kingdom. He is looking for someone to spend time with, someone to console him, someone to tell him he's a great guy after all. And he remembers she's not here. I did away with her. She was beautiful. She was comforting. She was a queen. And I did away with her in a drunken rage. And he's bothered by that. He remembers her and what she had done and what he had decreed against her. This is something that we note, that as soon as he comes back, he's lonely. He is sad. It's amazing if you really think about it, how many moving parts this story has, but they're all aligning with Esther being the queen. It tells us that God's plans cannot be hindered, even when he's working through secular and carnal events. Did God bring King Xerxes to a place of celebration and drunkenness so that he would move against Vashti? Did God undergird Vashti's self-importance so that she would make the right decision? Did God direct those men sitting around the king to decree to do away with the queen? Did God direct Philip of Macedon to defeat Xerxes and his opportunity to overtake Greece? And did God do all of that? Quite possibly. Because he's far above anything we can comprehend. And he's working. And his plans cannot be hindered. Even when he's working through secular and carnal events. Next we see this pageant that is organized. You see there his servants in verse 2, and they say, hey, king, we see you're lonely. We see you need a queen. Let there be fair young virgins sought for the king. Look at verse 4, and let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And this thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now, I want you to think about this. It's 127 provinces. Every fair young virgin inside of those 127 provinces was brought up to the palace. Some commentaries suggest that there were probably 400 of them. Esther is one. That means that if we're just going by the idea of karma, a luck, or fate, she has a 1 in 400 chance of being chosen. But when we're going by the sovereign, providential hand of God, she's the only one that matters. That's the kind of God I serve. It's the kind of God I desire to serve. We see that he brings them up, and in this passage it talks about, let me not go back on that. Look at verse 5. Now Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai. Come down to verse 7. And he brought up Hadassah. That means myrtle. That was Esther's Jewish name. Myrtle means fragrant. That is Esther. By the way, the myrtle has a little flower on it that has a star shape in the middle of it. That's where they come up with her name, Esther, the star. His uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. Come on and look a little further. Look in, what verse is that? Verse 8. That Esther was brought also up to the king's house to the custody of Haggai, keeper of the women. So here in this grand plan, in all of this activity, you have a queen that's been set aside, you have a king that's been defeated, you have these people that are trying to please the king with this grand beauty pageant of sorts. And in the midst of all that, we have two exiled Jews living in obscurity and anonymity. Here we have this old man who's unknown, Mordecai, he's a Jew. And we have Esther, she's a young lady between the age of 16 and 20, they say. They're nobody. Nobody's thinking about them. There was not talk around the barbershop that, boy, have you seen Mordecai's niece, Esther? Boy, she's beautiful. She ought to be the queen. There was none of that going on. Esther was not voted most likely to succeed in her class. She was not voted most likely to be the queen one day. Nobody knew anything about them. Only God did. They're obscure. They're anonymous. And suddenly, God thrust them into his plan. And we would not be exaggerating to believe that these two were quite unlikely to be used by God or to be seen as deliverers for their nation. But here we are, one old Jewish man and his cousin who he raised as his daughter, and suddenly they are thrust in as heroes in this tragic play, but not without risk. Listen to me. Not without risk, not without stress, not without worry, not without hardness, not without difficulty. This was not going to be easy. It was a war. Mordecai was going to worry about her. She was going to be thrust into a situation not unlike the situation that Daniel was thrust into. There was all the possibility in the world that she would just be another concubine. Not something you want for your supposed daughter, or that she would be unpleasing to the king and cast out. Not something that you want for your daughter. It was not without stress. I would say to you that we can learn from this that we must always be prepared to be used of God, no matter how insignificant you believe you are. You're important to God, and you're integral to his plan. I remember in the early days of my ministry, which wasn't that long ago, 15, 20 years, something like that. And I had all of these grand notions that I was going to be like Adrian Rogers or Junior Hill or some other famous preacher, evangelist, teacher. That I would pastor a large church, and it was all so self-centered. And God would move me through a few ministries to mature me a little bit. And he gave me great opportunities, and he put me under great men to teach me. And when I really felt as if I was prepared for the pastorate, and I began searching diligently for that church that was going to be my Bellevue, my huge moment, my grand stage. And the church that the Lord introduced me to was 25 people with no money in the bank, meeting in a borrowed room of a funeral home. I love my people and they love me, but we laugh about this often. Their initial job offer to me was for $100 a week, $400 a month. That was my Bellevue. That was my grand stage. But in my heart, I knew that God was in it. And I knew that it was not going to be easy, that it was not going to be without difficulty, that it was not going to push me and stretch me and my family. But we were willing, and God has blessed it. We have to always be prepared to be used of God, no matter how significant or insignificant you believe you may be. I want you to notice next that Esther is a gifted young lady. Look at verse 9. She's been brought in and introduced to this keeper of women. And it says and the maiden pleased him. And she obtained kindness of him. And speedily he gave her things for purification with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet to be given to her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. I would say that likely Esther had a similar spirit about her as Daniel, an excellent spirit. She has the beauty and the demeanor that others love. She is immediately set apart by this keeper. She is rewarded with a premium place to stay. She is preferred. Honestly, that should be the statement concerning all Christians. We should seek to separate ourselves by actions that are above and beyond. It should be that one has the best work ethic. This one is the friendliest and has the friendliest demeanor. That person has the sweetest spirit. The words that were spoken of Daniel, as I've already stated, was that he had an excellent spirit about himself. That should be said about the Christian, every Christian. But often, that's not the case. Often we find believers who feel as if they are entitled. You notice Esther doesn't do that. She possesses these traits before she was ever needed. Esther wasn't walking around Persia and around Shushan. She wasn't walking around there thinking highly of herself and expecting somebody to give her something and looking for a handout and believing she deserved something special. And then all of a sudden God thrust her into this position and she became humble and sweet and kind. That's not how it happens. She was practicing these traits before she was set aside by God, before she was the one to deliver her people. That's who she is. In fact, this is who she is under pressure, under an emergent need. She can exercise these qualities that she had developed while no one else was watching. But my mother just yesterday said, referring to something that she enjoyed listening to, that reputation is what other people believe you are, but character is what you truly are. That's what we're talking about here. This is what Esther was. She was truly this person. We as believers should be the best available at any time. We should be the most honest, the hardest working, the least expecting. That is glorifying God in all of our ways. That is how we should be as believers. That is the lesson we learn from Esther and Daniel and Joseph and David. Those people set those examples before God ever pulled them out and highlighted them. We see another attribute of Esther in verse 10. Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. She didn't tell him she was a Jew. Look further. It says, and Mordecai walked every day before the court of the women's house to know how Esther did and what should become of her. There's two truths I see here. The one is that we see this quality in Esther, and it's one that we should also seek to possess. She's obedient. She's faithfully obedient. She's trustingly obedient. I've already stated most accounts say that she's maybe 20 years old, but could be as young as 16. And yet here she is under pressure, following the orders of her uncle. We also get a glimpse of the serious nature of this episode as Mordecai would check daily to see if she was well, to see if she was safe, to see what would become of her. This was no light-hearted engagement. This was a difficult opportunity to serve. We're reminded that obedience, this is a children's moment, but we should all be like a child. Obedience is doing what you were told the first time you're told to do it. The children's song, we used to teach this to our children's church. Obedience is the very best way to show that you believe. Doing exactly what the Lord commands and doing it happily. Action is the key. Do it immediately. The joy you will receive, because obedience is the very best way to show that you believe. I would ask you, off the record, it's not in my outline, if your relationship to God was judged solely on your obedience to God, how saved would you be? That's ugly, isn't it? I'm thankful this is not a performance-based, works-based relationship I'm in. I'm thankful that He loves me even when I'm unlovely. But I should still strive for obedience. The next thing that we see, and we'll be finished here, is that she was successful. If you look down in verse 16, Esther was taken unto the king into his royal house in the 10th month, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And here we have it, the unseen, providential hand of God. Esther, one of 400, is chosen. She is not royalty. She is not wealthy. In fact, she's a refugee, at one time a captive. But here she is. Chuck Swindoll says, here she comes, Miss Persia. She's the queen. She's chosen. She has access to the most powerful man in the world at that time. God moving her into position to be able to deliver her people by His unseen hand. Psalm 75, 6 and 7. Promotion cometh neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south, but but God is the judge, and He putteth down one and setteth up another. God is sovereign. God is in control. Proverbs 21:1, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever He will. I would give you 2 points right here, and then I'll close, I promise. You and me, racked with worry and consternation over what is going to become of this virus, of this situation. Can we trust the government? What is the government doing? What is the president doing? What are the local officials doing? Can we believe them? Can we trust them? The one that you can believe and trust is God. He is going to do right because he is righteous, and he is in control. So let's rest assured in the sovereignty of God. I would leave you with this question. God takes this young refugee and he makes her the queen of Persia in a time that's very needful. The question is this: what could God do with you? What could God do with you if you were obedient, faithful, available, and willing? I want you to meditate on that this week. What could God do with me if I'm obedient, faithful, willing, and available? Father, we thank you for this good night. Lord, I pray you'd bless us, strengthen us, help us, Lord, to be approved. Help us, Father, to please you. God, we love you and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you. I'll see you next week.